Millionaire enters abandoned garage daily with black girl. Neighbor shocked after discovering why. Outside, a rustling sound broke the silence. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, peering through the chain-link fence that separated the garage from the rest of the neighborhood. It was a neighbor, someone who had lived on the street for years, but had never paid much attention to James or his strange visits. Until now. The neighbor squinted, trying to make sense of what was going on. The sight of James, always so private and composed, entering the abandoned garage every day, and with a girl no one seemed to recognize, was enough to spark their curiosity. But what really caught their attention was the urgency in the girl's voice, the way she seemed so serious, so focused. What were they doing in there? And why was James, of all people, spending his mornings in a place like that? The neighbor stepped back, ducking behind a tree, their heart racing. Something was off, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing something important, something that, if they didn't understand soon, might change everything. Back inside the garage, James continued to work, his brow furrowed as he scribbled on the papers in front of him. The girl watched him closely, her expression unreadable. Finally, the quiet was broken by a soft voice from the doorway. "What are you two doing in there every day?" the neighbor asked, their voice shaking just slightly as they stood in the garage's shadow. James froze for a moment, his pen hovering over the paper. The girl looked up, her eyes narrowing as she glanced toward the door. Neither of them answered, but the tension between them seemed to grow heavier, the question hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. The neighbor's eyes widened in disbelief. What was going on inside that garage? And more importantly, what was James Thompson hiding? Before we dive deeper into this mysterious story, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed something so strange or unexpected in your neighborhood that it left you wondering what was really going on? Or maybe you've had your own experience where a neighbor's behavior caught your attention, sparking curiosity. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have many more captivating stories to share, and you won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Stay with us as we uncover what's really happening behind those garage doors. You won't believe what's coming next. Now, let's return to James and the mysterious girl. James Thompson was a name that carried weight in the world of business. A self-made millionaire, his face had graced the covers of magazines, his success story spoken about in boardrooms and entrepreneurial circles. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but an idea and an unwavering determination to prove himself. A true testament to the American dream, James had once been a young man with little more than ambition and grit to his name. Born in a small, run-down neighborhood, James' early years were defined by struggle. His mother, a nurse, had worked long hours to support him and his two younger siblings after their father abandoned them when James was just 5 years old. It was a life of scarcity, where luxuries like toys or new clothes were rare. But his mother's resilience became his foundation. She taught him the value of hard work, of never settling, and above all, of never showing weakness. James remembered long nights spent studying by the dim light of a single lamp, his mother's tired voice in the background, telling him that education was his ticket out. But even as he excelled academically, he knew that simply working hard wasn't enough in a world stacked against him. He had to be smarter, faster, and willing to take risks others weren't willing to take. As a young adult, James took his first job at a tech startup, working tirelessly to learn everything he could. He quickly became known for his razor-sharp intellect and an almost eerie ability to predict market trends. He soon left the company to start his own, using the few $1,000s he'd saved up to create a software that would revolutionize data analytics. His company exploded into success, securing major contracts with top firms, and James, still in his late 20s, became a millionaire. The accolades poured in. He was the golden boy of Silicon Valley, the type of man who could buy anything he wanted, live anywhere, and have anyone by his side. But wealth didn't bring him peace. Despite his public persona as a savvy businessman, James struggled with loneliness. He had few close relationships, and the ones he did have were always transactional. People admired him, yes, but they never truly knew him. His friends and colleagues often assumed that James had everything figured out, that his life was a well-oiled machine. But underneath the polished exterior, he was battling a quiet storm. In his moments of solitude, when he sat in the lavish penthouse apartment overlooking the city, he often wondered if he had traded his soul for success. The isolation, the constant pressure to be perfect, it weighed on him. There was always this sense of longing, a desire for something more than what money and fame could provide. The abandoned garage had been a secret place for James for nearly a year. It wasn't a place he'd ever mentioned to anyone, not his business partners, not his clients, not even his closest friends. It was his escape from the world that had begun to feel suffocating. When James first found the garage, it had been a chance encounter. He'd been on a jog one morning, trying to clear his mind, when he saw the decrepit structure at the edge of the neighborhood. It was odd, standing out like a forgotten relic in a sea of new homes. Curiosity got the better of him, and he walked toward it, pushing the door open with ease. Inside, he found remnants of another time, old newspapers, rusted tools, and broken furniture scattered across the floor. But in the silence, there was peace. No business calls, no investors, no expectations. Just a quiet space that allowed him to breathe. James didn't know why he felt so drawn to the place, but over time, it became his retreat. Every morning, before the world woke up, he would go to the garage. It was in this garage that he met Alia, the girl who had somehow woven herself into the fabric of his existence. Alia was the complete opposite of James in almost every way. Where he had been born into privilege and wealth, she had grown up in the shadows of poverty, in a neighborhood much like the one he'd left behind. The daughter of a single mother, Alia had known hardship from a young age. Her mother, a daycare worker, had done her best to provide, but the odds were always stacked against them. The school she attended was underfunded, the streets were often dangerous, and dreams were something you heard about on TV, but never got to experience. But Alia had a quiet resilience that defied her circumstances. She was a brilliant student, not because it was easy, but because she fought for every ounce of knowledge she could absorb. Her teachers often marveled at her intellect and drive, but they couldn't ignore the subtle signs of stress in her eyes. Despite the bright smile she wore for the world, inside, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had been working part-time since she was 14, taking up odd jobs to help her mother pay the bills. But school remained her sanctuary. It was where she could dream of something bigger than her circumstances. Alia's aspirations were simple. She wanted to be the first in her family to attend college, to break free from the cycle of poverty. Yet, she knew this was easier said than done. Her life had intersected with James in the most unlikely of places, the garage. Alia's mother had once worked for James' family as a housekeeper, and when James had come across Alia one day, rummaging through the garage, searching for some lost belonging, he hadn't initially known who she was. But when he learned that she was the daughter of the woman who had once worked for his family, something clicked. He had seen the spark in her eyes, the same drive and intelligence he had once possessed. James had been taken aback by how much she reminded him of his younger self. He had an almost instant connection with Alia, and over time, they found a strange companionship in the garage. The place, once just a refuge for James, had become a meeting ground for the two of them, a space where they could talk about their shared struggles, about life, about dreams. Though their relationship was unconventional, there was an undeniable bond between them. James saw in Alia a reflection of his past, the unpolished, hungry young man who would stop at nothing to succeed. And Alia, despite her pride and self-sufficiency, saw in James the mentor she never had, someone who could help her unlock the door to a brighter future. What neither James nor Alia realized at first was that the garage was no longer just a place of refuge, it was becoming a place of transformation. Over the course of months, they would spend hours together in the quiet solitude of the space, working on various projects, mostly related to Alia's education. James had begun to help her apply for scholarships, guide her through college applications, and even connect her with some of his influential business contacts. But there was something else brewing beneath the surface, something more profound than just academic assistance. James was slowly but surely rediscovering the things that truly mattered. The more time he spent with Alia, the more he realized how empty his own life had become, despite all the wealth and success he had accumulated. In helping Alia, he began to reconnect with the values he had once held dear, values of integrity, empathy, and community. Alia, in turn, began to see beyond the suit and the wealth. She saw the man beneath the exterior, the man who was just as vulnerable and lost as she had been at one point in her life. Through their conversations, James began to understand the true meaning of connection and purpose. No longer did he want to hide behind his money or his success. He wanted to make a real difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. It was in the garage, in the quiet moments they shared, that both of them began to change. James found redemption in helping someone else achieve their dreams, and Alia found hope in knowing that someone saw her potential, that she wasn't just another statistic to be ignored. Their relationship, unlikely and unconventional as it was, would become the catalyst for something even greater than they could have ever imagined. It was the kind of day that felt like any other. James had spent the morning in meetings with his executive team, discussing the growth of his company and negotiating deals that would further cement his legacy. Yet, as the afternoon stretched on, a nagging sense of unease began to settle in his chest, like a storm brewing on the horizon. It wasn't the business, it wasn't the contracts, it was something else entirely, something personal that had been eating away at him for weeks. His meetings had ended early that day, and with no pressing matters left to attend to, James decided to head to the garage, his quiet haven, to clear his mind. Alia was already there when he arrived. She was sitting cross-legged on the old wooden floor, surrounded by piles of textbooks and notebooks. James could hear the soft rustle of papers as she scribbled notes, the hum of a nearby old fan adding to the otherwise serene atmosphere. It was the kind of peace he had come to rely on, the kind of solitude that allowed him to focus. But something was different today. Alia looked up from her work, her eyes tired but determined. James noticed the furrow in her brow, the way her normally cheerful demeanor had shifted. He hadn't seen her like this in months. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of concern. Alia hesitated for a moment before responding, as though weighing how much to share. Finally, she spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "There's something you need to know about my mother," she began. "She's been having some health problems she hasn't told me about. She's not getting better, James. I think she's hiding it from me." The revelation hit James like a punch to the stomach. Alia's mother, the woman who had spent countless hours working in his family's home, who had supported Alia through every hardship, was sick. And not just sick, but seriously ill. Alia's voice trembled as she continued. "I took her to the doctor last week," she said, her voice breaking, "and they told me it's cancer. Stage 4. It's too late for treatment." James stood there in stunned silence. He had known Alia's mother for years, though never in any depth. He had always seen her as a quiet, diligent woman, doing her job without complaint. But hearing the news now, hearing the pain in Alia's voice, he was overcome with a sense of helplessness he hadn't felt in years. For a long moment, The two of them stood in the silence of the garage, the gravity of the situation hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't just about a diagnosis. It was about Alia's world being turned upside down. The walls that had once seemed so solid were now cracked, and everything she had worked for, everything she had hoped for, felt fragile in the face of such an overwhelming reality. Later that evening, James sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling far below. The cold glass of his scotch was barely touched. His mind was racing, consumed with thoughts of Alia, her mother, and the world he had so carefully built for himself. He knew the reality was this: his wealth, his success, none of it mattered in the face of something as cruel as cancer. He could build empires, but he couldn't save a life. But what struck him the most was the realization that Alia's mother's illness wasn't just a tragedy, it was a catalyst. It forced James to confront the very thing he had been avoiding for so long, his own purpose. He had spent so many years chasing after success, after the idea of becoming something great, that he had forgotten what it truly meant to help others, to make a real impact. The garage, which had once been a place of peace, now felt suffocating. James knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand by and watch Alia go through this alone. But what could he do? He had the money, the resources, but how could he truly make a difference in a situation like this? It was then that the idea came to him, not as a flash of brilliance, but as a simple, undeniable truth. He could use everything he had at his disposal, the power, the influence, the connections, to help Alia's family. But more importantly, he could help her fulfill her dreams, the dreams she had put on hold for so long. He knew that Alia's future was hanging by a thread, and now, more than ever, he had to make sure it wasn't a future defined by hardship and grief. The next day, James sat down with his team of lawyers and financial advisors. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to wait for things to get worse. If he was going to make a difference, he needed to act now. With a series of phone calls and meetings, James began the process of restructuring his company. He would donate a significant portion of his wealth to cancer research, but more importantly, he would set up a trust for Alia's education and future. His connections in the education sector would ensure that she would have a path to success, even if her personal circumstances remained grim. But his decision wasn't without risks. The public would be watching, and it was one thing to be philanthropic when it didn't affect your personal life, but quite another to tie your reputation to someone else's future. James knew there would be scrutiny, perhaps even backlash, from his investors and business partners. But in that moment, none of that mattered. His reputation, his wealth, none of it would bring peace to Alia or her mother. But what he could offer was a chance for her to finish what she had started, a chance to move forward despite the pain and loss that lay ahead. As he signed the paperwork, officially committing to his decision, a wave of both relief and fear washed over him. He had crossed a line from which there would be no turning back. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was someone who was willing to put it all on the line for something bigger than himself. The stakes were now personal, and the consequences of failure weighed heavily on his shoulders. James didn't know if this would be enough to help Alia's mother. He didn't know if it would be enough to ease the pain or fill the void that would soon be left behind. But as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he understood one undeniable truth. He was no longer the man he had once been. The catalyst, Alia's mother's illness, had shattered the illusions he had built around his life. And now, as the world moved forward, he found himself driven by something entirely new, a sense of purpose that would propel him into the future, no matter the cost. James thought he had prepared himself for the inevitable challenges that would come with his decision to help Alia and her family. But nothing could have prepared him for the emotional turmoil and the unforeseen complications that followed. It was as though every step forward led to 2 steps back, as if the universe had decided to test the limits of his commitment. The conflict had only just begun. The first cracks in James's well-intentioned plan appeared when Aaliyah began to pull away. Initially, she had been grateful for his support, but as the days turned into weeks, her attitude toward him began to shift. She had always been independent, fiercely protective of her privacy, and now, with her mother's health deteriorating, her need for space grew even more pronounced. She started to decline James's offers for help, becoming distant and aloof. "I don't need you to do this for me, James," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp with an edge of anger. "I didn't ask for you to fix everything. This isn't something you can just solve with money." James was stunned by her words. He had always known that Aaliyah had a strong will, but hearing her reject his help stung more than he expected. He had tried to do the right thing. He was doing this because he wanted to see her succeed, to make sure she had the opportunity she deserved, even if it meant sacrificing some of his own comfort. "I'm not trying to fix it," James replied softly. "I'm just trying to be there for you. We're friends, Aaliyah. I just want to help." But Aaliyah wasn't having it. Her eyes flashed with a mixture of pain and frustration. "You don't get it, James," she snapped. "I don't need your pity, and I sure as hell don't need you to play the hero. My mom needs me, not you. And I don't know if I can handle this alone, but I'll be damned if I let you take over my life." The words cut deep, and James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't expected things to be this hard. He thought he could simply step in, offer financial support, and everything would fall into place. But Aaliyah wasn't asking for a solution. She was asking for something else entirely: understanding, space, and respect for the painful reality she was living. Aaliyah's emotional state worsened over the next few days. Her mother's condition continued to decline, and with it, Aaliyah's resilience began to crumble. The garage, which had once been a sanctuary for the two of them, began to feel suffocating. She withdrew into herself, spending hours poring over medical articles online, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. She hadn't told anyone about her mother's condition until now, and the burden of secrecy began to weigh heavily on her. She didn't know who to trust, and worse, she didn't know if anyone truly understood what she was going through. One evening, James stopped by the garage to find her sitting in the corner, her face buried in her hands. The air was thick with tension, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. "Aaliyah," he said softly, his voice full of concern, "what's going on?" Aaliyah looked up at him, her eyes swollen from crying. She shook her head, trying to hide the tears that kept falling. "I don't want your help, James. I can't let you in anymore." Her words stung, but they also revealed something deeper. Aaliyah was drowning in her own grief, and she had no idea how to reach out for help. The walls she had built around herself were becoming impenetrable, and every time James tried to break them down, she pulled away even further. James felt like he was losing her. He couldn't bear to see the woman he cared about in so much pain, and yet every attempt he made to help her only seemed to push her further away. "I'm not giving up on you, Aaliyah," James said firmly, his voice full of resolve. "I'm here, no matter what. But I need you to let me in. You don't have to go through this alone." But Aaliyah remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. The silence between them was unbearable, and James knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He could offer all the help in the world, but it was clear that Aaliyah wasn't ready to accept it. The conflict reached a breaking point when James overheard a conversation between Aaliyah and a close friend of hers. James had been out for a jog when he saw Aaliyah in a nearby cafe, speaking in hushed tones with a woman he had never seen before. Intrigued, he walked closer to hear what they were saying. As he approached, he caught a few words that stopped him dead in his tracks. "You have to tell him, Aaliyah," the woman said. "He has the resources, the power. You can't keep pretending everything's okay. It's the only way." James froze, his heart racing. He had no idea what they were talking about, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Alaya responded in a quiet, almost defeated voice. I can't. It's too much. He'll hate me if he finds out. The words echoed in James's mind, and his curiosity and concern overwhelmed him. He waited for them to finish their conversation, but Alia's body language told him everything he needed to know. There was a secret she was hiding from him, something that, if revealed, could change everything. Later that evening, James confronted her in the garage. He tried to keep his voice calm, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. Alia, he began, I overheard something today. You don't have to keep anything from me. You know you can trust me. Alia looked up, her eyes filled with conflict. She bit her lip, clearly torn between wanting to confess and the fear of losing everything. It's not what you think, she said softly, her voice cracking. But I'm afraid if you know the truth, you won't look at me the same way. The tension in the room was palpable. James's mind raced with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared him for the revelation that followed. My mom's cancer isn't just stage 4, Alia said, her voice trembling. It's genetic. She's been battling it for years, and I'm at risk too. I've been avoiding tests because I don't want to know, but the doctor said I should be tested soon. I could have it too, James. I could die just like she did. The words hit James like a bolt of lightning, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His mind struggled to process the information. A lawyer had been carrying this burden alone, hiding the truth even from him, someone who genuinely cared for her. It made sense now, the distance, the secretive nature of her actions, the sudden withdrawal. She had been living in constant fear, not just for her mother, but for herself. The future that she had once envisioned was now uncertain, a cloud of dread hanging over everything she did. I'm so sorry, James, Alia whispered. I didn't want you to pity me. I didn't want anyone to think I was broken. James reached out, placing his hand on her shoulder. He could feel the weight of her fear, the magnitude of the decision she was facing. You're not broken, Alia, he said gently, but you don't have to face this alone. I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together. But deep inside, James knew the truth. Alia's journey was only just beginning, and the road ahead would be filled with pain, fear, and uncertainty. And he was right there beside her, uncertain himself, but determined to face whatever came next. As the days went by, James felt himself becoming increasingly submerged in Alia's world, a world filled with hope and despair, joy and sorrow. He had been so certain that his efforts to help her would bring them closer, but the road ahead was filled with moments of heartbreak, realization, and unexpected courage. These emotional turning points were not only pivotal for Alia, but for James as well, each one forcing him to confront his own limits, his own feelings, and the fragility of human connection. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when James first felt the true weight of Alia's emotional distance. They had been inseparable for weeks, working tirelessly on her mother's treatment and providing whatever support they could. James had felt a sense of pride in his role, but Alia's recent withdrawal left him struggling to keep up. She was no longer the woman he had known, strong, independent, and focused, but rather a shell of her former self, caught between the fragility of her mother's health and her own paralyzing fears about her future. One evening, after a long day of research on alternative treatments for Alia's mother, James tried to approach her. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the downpour, lost in thought. The silence between them felt heavier than ever. Alia, James began, his voice tentative, I've been trying to help. I know it's not easy, but we can get through this together. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The distance in her eyes sent a jolt of panic through his chest. I don't think you can help me anymore, James. The words hit like a physical blow. James recoiled, trying to process what she was saying. What do you mean? I've been here for you. I thought. I don't need you to save me. Aaliyah interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. I need to save myself. I can't rely on you anymore. I can't keep leaning on you. You've been amazing, but I need to do this alone. The hurt in her voice broke something inside James. He understood the need for independence. He had been raised with the same values of self-sufficiency, but it felt like a betrayal. The woman he cared for was pushing him away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He tried to speak, to reassure her, but the words stuck in his throat. Aaliyah stood up, wiping a tear from her cheek. I'm sorry, James. I can't. She walked toward the door, leaving him standing there, his heart heavy with confusion and pain. In that moment, James realized the depth of Aaliyah's inner turmoil. This wasn't just about her mother's illness. It was about something far deeper. Her fear, her guilt, her overwhelming need to protect herself from the very thing she feared most, losing everything. Her rejection of his help wasn't just a refusal of his assistance. It was her way of trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to manage. But deep inside, James knew the truth. Aaliyah's journey was only just beginning, and the road ahead would be filled with pain, fear, and uncertainty. And he was right there beside her, uncertain himself, but determined to face whatever came next. As the days went by, James felt himself becoming increasingly submerged in Aaliyah's world, a world filled with hope and despair, joy and sorrow. He had been so certain that his efforts to help her would bring them closer, but the road ahead was filled with moments of heartbreak, realization, and unexpected courage. These emotional turning points were not only pivotal for Aaliyah, but for James as well, each one forcing him to confront his own limits, his own feelings, and the fragility of human connection. The turning point came a few days later, when James received a phone call from Aaliyah late at night. He hadn't heard from her since their confrontation, and the silence had been suffocating. When the phone rang, he almost didn't pick it up. But something in his gut told him that this call was different. Aaliyah? James answered, his voice thick with concern. What's going on? She didn't respond right away. Instead, he could hear her struggling to breathe on the other end, her sobs breaking through the silence. I'm sorry, Aaliyah gasped, the words coming out in a strangled whisper. I don't know what to do anymore, James. I'm so scared. I can't do this. I don't want to lose her. The raw vulnerability in her voice was like a dagger to James's heart. All the barriers she had built between them, the rejection, the anger, the emotional distance, were suddenly swept away. She was no longer the strong, independent woman who had pushed him away. She was just a daughter, a woman terrified of losing the most important person in her life. James's instincts kicked in, and he knew exactly what he had to do. You're not alone, Aaliyah. You don't have to face this by yourself. Aaliyah's breathing steadied, though her voice remained shaky. I don't want to be a burden to you. I don't want you to feel obligated. I'm so sorry for pushing you away. Stop, James said, his voice firm yet gentle. You're not a burden. You're my friend. And I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together. We've always figured things out together. The words brought a sense of peace to both of them, but the truth was, James had never felt more uncertain. He didn't know what the future held for Aaliyah's mother or for Aaliyah herself, but he did know one thing. They had to face it as a team. For the first time in weeks, they were on the same page again, and even though the road ahead was uncertain, that sense of unity gave James a renewed sense of hope. The true test of Aaliyah's courage came the next week, when she finally decided to face the truth about her health. For months, she had been avoiding the tests her doctor had recommended, convinced that if she didn't know, she wouldn't have to confront the reality that she might be walking in her mother's footsteps. But after their emotional breakthrough, she knew she had to face it. James, I'm going to do it, Aaliyah said one morning, her voice quieter than usual. Do what? James asked, unable to hide the confusion in his voice. "I'm going to take the test," she replied. "I can't keep pretending I'm okay. I need to know if I'm going to have the same fate. I need to be prepared, for myself and for my mom." James's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't just the courage to take the test. It was the courage to face the unknown. It was the courage to admit her vulnerability and accept the possibility that her fears might be realized. "I'm proud of you," James said, his voice filled with admiration. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it together. You're not alone in this." Aaliyah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached out, squeezing his hand tightly. "Thank you, James. I don't know what I would have done without you." Aaliyah's decision to take the test marked a significant turning point in her journey. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of control over her life, even though the outcome of the test was still uncertain. She had faced her fears and made a choice to move forward, no matter what it meant for her future. And James, who had once felt like an outsider in her world, now knew that his role wasn't to fix her, but to walk alongside her, offering unwavering support. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. There were still moments of doubt, fear, and emotional struggle ahead, but the crucial emotional baits, the heartbreak, the realization, and the courage, had forged a deeper connection between James and Aaliyah. Their bond, tested and strained, had become something stronger than either of them had imagined. And though the future was still uncertain, there was one thing James knew for sure. They would face whatever came next together, with open hearts and unwavering courage. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the small living room where James and Aaliyah sat, waiting for the phone call that would change everything. Aaliyah had just returned from the doctor's office, the place where her fate would be decided. The test results, the combination of months of fear and uncertainty, were finally ready. James sat across from her, his hands folded in his lap. His heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear, not just for Aaliyah's health, but for the emotional journey they had shared. The past months had tested them both in ways neither had expected, and now, here they were, at the crossroads of uncertainty and redemption. Aaliyah reached for the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. She took a deep breath before dialing the number. James watched her, his mind racing through the memories of the moments that had led them here, the late-night conversations, the tears, the breakthroughs, and the painful separations. Each one had brought them closer in its own way. And now, this final call would be the culmination of it all. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice on the other end answered. "Hello, Aaliyah." The voice was calm, but James could hear the weight of the moment in the tone. "Yes, this is Aaliyah. I'm calling for my test results," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness coursing through her veins. There was a pause, the tension thick in the room. "We've received your results," the doctor continued, "and I'm happy to tell you that everything looks normal. There is no sign of the condition we feared." Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The relief that flooded her system was so overwhelming it nearly left her speechless. She glanced at James, her eyes wide, the weight of her fear and anxiety lifting in an instant. "Are you sure?" Aaliyah asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "I mean, there's no mistake." "I'm sure," the doctor assured her. "You're in the clear." Aaliyah dropped the phone into her lap, her body trembling as tears welled in her eyes. James was already at her side, pulling her into a hug, as if to protect her from the wave of emotion that was threatening to overwhelm her. For a moment, they simply held each other in silence, the weight of the past few months finally giving way to a sense of peace. Aaliyah's fears had been so all-consuming that she hadn't allowed herself to hope, let alone believe in the possibility of good news. And now, that hope was finally realized. But it wasn't just the test result that brought her this peace. It was the journey she had taken to get here. Aaliyah had learned to accept her vulnerability, something she had never allowed herself to do before. She had been determined to face her struggles alone, afraid that asking for help would make her weak. But the truth was, the people she had allowed into her life, especially James, had been her greatest source of strength. She had pushed him away in her moments of fear, thinking that pushing others out was the only way to protect herself. But through the highs and lows, James had never left her side. His unwavering support had not only helped her through her darkest moments, but it had also taught her the importance of allowing others to help, to lean on them when the burden felt too heavy. As Aaliyah looked at James, she saw the person who had remained steadfast, despite the emotional roller coaster. She saw the man who had stayed when others would have walked away, the man who had quietly supported her without asking for anything in return. She realized that her fear had caused her to shut out the very person who had been her greatest ally, and in doing so, she had denied herself the opportunity for real connection. But now she knew better. She had learned that strength wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about accepting help, sharing the load, and trusting others enough to let them in. "I don't know how to thank you, James," Aaliyah whispered, her voice still thick with emotion. "You've been here through all of it. I pushed you away so many times, and you still stayed. I don't deserve you." James smiled gently, his eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to thank me, Aaliyah. I was never going anywhere. You just needed to see that it was okay to let people in. It's okay to rely on the people who care about you. You've learned that, and that's a huge step." Aaliyah nodded, her chest heavy with gratitude. The fear that had defined her existence for so long was finally lifting, and in its place was a sense of clarity and peace. She wasn't alone in this world, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. For James, the journey was no less transformative. He had always prided himself on being independent, on keeping his emotions in check, and on solving problems with logic and action. But through his relationship with Aaliyah, he had discovered a new side of himself, the part that was willing to be vulnerable, to open his heart, and to put someone else's needs before his own. He had learned that sometimes the best way to help someone was not by offering solutions, but by simply being there for them. He had offered Aaliyah his support not because he wanted to fix her problems, but because he cared for her deeply. And through that process, he had grown as well. He had learned the importance of emotional connection, of being present even when there were no answers, and of being patient as others navigated their struggles. The growth wasn't just in Aaliyah, it was in him too. James now understood that emotional support was as powerful as any physical action. And in choosing to walk alongside Aaliyah, he had discovered a depth of compassion that had been dormant within him for years. The resolution of their journey wasn't just about the test result. It was about the deeper lesson they had both learned. That growth comes not from facing challenges alone, but from facing them together. The bond that had formed between them was not just one of mutual dependence, but of mutual respect and trust. They had learned to rely on each other, to be vulnerable with one another, and to share the weight of their fears. For Aaliyah, the test result had been the final piece of a larger puzzle. She had faced her own fears, embraced vulnerability, and come out stronger on the other side. And for James, it had been a lesson in unconditional support and the power of standing by someone, not because you can fix their problems, but because you care enough to help them find their own way. The moral of their story was clear. Growth is not a solitary journey. It's through connection, through sharing our struggles and allowing others to share theirs, that we find the strength to overcome the obstacles in our path. And in doing so, we discover the true power of human resilience. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Aaliyah and James stood together on the balcony of their small apartment, hand in hand. The wake of the past few months had lifted, and with it came a newfound sense of peace and possibility. They looked out at the world, a city alive with motion, yet, for the first time in a long time, they felt a stillness inside, a quiet certainty that they had overcome something profound together. Alia turned to James, her heart full of gratitude. The man she had once pushed away had become her anchor, her support, and her strength. But more than that, he had shown her the power of forgiveness, not just forgiveness toward others, but also toward herself. She had spent so long carrying the burden of her own fears, guilt, and insecurities, afraid that her vulnerability would make her weak. But through James's unwavering presence, she had learned that it was okay to let go of that burden. It was okay to ask for help. It was okay to be imperfect. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Alia whispered, her voice full of emotion. James smiled, his eyes full of warmth. "There was never a question of giving up. I didn't stay because you were broken. I stayed because I knew you weren't. And now you know that too." Alia smiled through the tears that welled up in her eyes. It had been a long road to get here, but now, standing beside him, she felt stronger than ever. She had learned to face her fears, to trust in herself, and to trust in the people who loved her. She had learned that the road to healing was not always linear, but with patience, love, and understanding, it was always worth the effort. James squeezed her hand. "We've come so far, haven't we?" Alia nodded. "We have. But more importantly, we're here, together." And it wasn't just about the two of them. It was about the broader lesson they had both learned, that healing and growth often come when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to open our hearts, and to let go of the things that weigh us down. The obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable, the doubts, the fears, the pain, had all faded into the background. They had faced them head-on. But more importantly, they had faced them together. And in that unity, they had discovered the true power of transformation. The journey had been hard, but it had also been beautiful. They had rebuilt their relationship, yes, but they had also rebuilt themselves. Through the love they had for each other, they had discovered the love they had for themselves. They had come to realize that forgiveness was not just about absolving others. It was about releasing themselves from the chains of their own past mistakes, regrets, and fears. It was about embracing who they were and accepting that they were enough. Alia took a deep breath, a soft smile spreading across her face. "You know, I used to think that everything had to be perfect, that if I wasn't perfect, I wasn't worthy of love. But now, I see that the imperfections are what make us who we are. The struggle, the growth, the mistakes, all of it. That's what makes us human." James nodded, his heart full. "Exactly. It's the messy parts that give life meaning. And it's through those parts that we learn to love ourselves and each other." Together, they stood, watching the last rays of the sun slip below the horizon, knowing that the journey ahead would not always be easy. But they also knew that whatever came next, they would face it with the same strength, love, and courage they had discovered through this chapter of their lives. They were no longer two people standing alone. They were a team, bound together by shared experiences and the unshakable belief that they were stronger together. And so, the story ended not with a perfect resolution, but with the promise of new beginnings, of growth and healing, and of a love that was both deep and enduring. The road ahead might be uncertain, but Alia and James have learned the most important lesson of all, that no matter what, they were never truly alone. In the end, it wasn't the challenges that defined them, but their ability to rise above them, to forgive, to grow, to love. And in that, they found their redemption, not just in each other, but in themselves. As the stars began to twinkle above, they stepped forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together they could conquer anything. And there you have it, Alia and James's journey of love, healing, and transformation. What an incredible story of redemption, right? But now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Alia's shoes, struggling with past fears and doubts, how would you have handled the challenges she faced? Or, if you were James, What would you have done to help her heal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that will inspire, challenge, and make you think. We have many more incredible stories like this one coming your way. Remember, you're never alone in your journey. Together, we can grow, heal, and transform. Thanks for watching.